Good evening, everyone. We're going to be starting our program now. My name is Daniel Jocelyn Simatowski. I'm the Kraft Family Professor and Director of the Center for Christian Jewish Learning here at Boston College, and I'm very pleased to welcome you here tonight. I'm also grateful for the support of the Jesuit Institute at Boston College and their co-sponsorship with Father James Keenan directing. Thank you, and it's nice to see so many members of the Boston College Jesuit community here as well. So I'm very pleased to have you all here in person and online for this panel discussion of Professor James Bernauer's new book, Auschwitz and Absolution, the case of the Commandant and the Confessor. This panel seems especially timely since a film based on the topic of this book, The Zone of Interest, has recently been nominated for an Academy Award for Best Picture. So let me now introduce our author, James Bernauer, who is a Jesuit priest and the Kraft Family Professor of Philosophy Emeritus and former director of the Center for Christian Jewish Learning at Boston College. That is, I took his job. And he, along with being author of Auschwitz and Absolution, he is the author of Jesuit Kaddish, Jesuit Jews and Holocaust Remembrance, and The Tragic Couple, Encounters Between Jews and Jesuits. His fields of interest include Holocaust studies, Jesuits and Jews during the Holocaust, German Jewry, and the philosophies of Michel Foucault and Hannah Arendt. So let me, before we get going, let me just say a little bit how we're going to proceed. First, Jim will offer some introductory remarks and reflections on his book and his interest in writing it and how it is an important topic for today. And then this book was actually an edited collection with Jim's introductory material and then various, about 15 people contributing essays. Excuse me? 17. It was a lot. And we have 4 of our local contributors here. We'll be serving as a panel. I'll be asking them questions about their contributions. And our goal is to get a dialogue going among the panelists and Jim, and then eventually turning it over to the audience as well for Q&A. We'll have microphones for you. And then we'll wrap up within about an hour or so from now. So Jim, please, the floor is yours. If you'd like to offer a few words, and we'll switch spots for a moment.
I'm getting the hint.
Introductory remarks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dan, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. It's nice to see you. Very familiar faces, many of you. I have the pleasant task of, at the end of a book publication, of thanking people. So that's how I begin. So thanks to Dan, the Center for Christian Jewish Learning, and to Jim Keenan of the Jesuit Institute for sponsoring this conversation. Yeah, everyone can hear me, I presume. I don't have the deep voice that you have, though. A little lower. And then I want to thank Dr. Camille Markey for organizing it. She always does a great job of organization, as I knew when I was director of the center. And of course, I'm very grateful for the thoughtful comments of our 17 Jewish and Christian commentators who make up the second part of the book. And especially to the 4 who are here today. They came over from places as far as Cambridge and Brookline and Newton. So thank you for coming. And I'm very appreciative of the many at Orbis Press who worked on this volume enthusiastically from its very beginning. It's the first time I've ever worked with Orbis Press, but I recommend it highly to your memoirs, because I sent them, and they in the description they said something about waiting 6 weeks, and I heard within a week that we like your ideas. So that was nice, and especially John Sweeney, who was the editor at the time, who worked for Orbis Press. I have but a few minutes. So I'd like to deal briefly with 2 questions. The first, how did the book come to be? And secondly, what insights might people derive from reading it? Does it promote, in the end, understanding between Christians and Jews? First, In recent years, the Holocaust and Jesuit experience during that period have become my academic focus. A few years ago, I had lunch with Father Manfred Desselaers, who has been assigned by his German bishop to live in Auschwitz, where he's lived since 1990. And he guides groups that come through. He works at the Center for Dialogue and Prayer. And he's a remarkable person. And we had lunch together in Brookline, and he casually mentioned over the meal something that I had never heard before, namely that the Commandant of Auschwitz had met with a Polish Jesuit priest for confession before his 1947 execution. This was Father Władysław Lohm, who was fluent in the German language, and as a result, he was asked by the Cardinal of Krakow to meet with Rudolf Hess, the Commandant who had requested the visit. I was already somewhat familiar with Hess because his memoirs had been published several years ago, and there was a dramatic film about him based on that memoir. It's called The Interrogation. Rather difficult film to watch. It's just, well, it is online, so if you're interested, The Interrogation. Hus never really interested me because even by Nazi standards, he seemed very shallow. And as several of our contributors point out in the book, he was constantly making excuses for what he had done. And he had been Commandant for several years of Auschwitz. He wrote of himself as an unknowing cog in the machine of Nazi destruction, unknowing. His memoir itself voices multiple anti-Semitic fantasies. And this is after he's writing this at the bequest of the Polish authorities when he was in prison. So it's 1946, 1947, he's writing it. But he still has these anti-Semitic fantasies. And he reaches the conclusion in his memoir that the murder of the Jews has not served the goals of Nazi anti-Semitism. So it's a strange book to read. A change is perhaps able to be detected in Hirsch's last statements in the days after his conversation with Father Lohm. For example, in a final letter, he advises his wife to stay faithful to the Christian faith, and his very last statement confesses his personal guilt for crimes against humanity. Even in that unique admission, though, there is no explicit mention of the Jews as his victims. The Commandant of Auschwitz continues to captivate others, not myself, but others, as a casual glance at YouTube would show. There's much on Hus on YouTube. Some of it is quite bizarre. There's even a lengthy 2022 music video of the encounter between the Commandant and the Confessor, which has this repetitious refrain, and it really is repetitious. They must do it 20 times in the song. Nothing separates you from love if you just own up. Nothing if you just own up, and that's the theme constantly being repeated. It's not a bad video, though. They actually are accurate about the fact that Lohm met with Hus. They have actors. It was done in Poland, but it's a musical group that I had never heard of, and I forget now. It's an English musical group. And then, as Dan mentioned, a new movie was released last year and has received almost universal praise, as well as numerous awards already. The Zone of Interest. It is up for this year. It's up for 2 Academy Awards. Best Foreign Film, that was put forward by Britain as their candidate, and then Best Film of the Year, which is the list that just came out 2 days ago. Its focus is on how normal Hirsch's family life was in Auschwitz, and it makes me nervous seeing it, although I know many others I thought it was an excellent film, a masterpiece, as one German told me. The problem is with the normalization. Of course we surrender too easily to situations as normal. This is one of the points Hannah Arendt always made, that we walk into situations and presume that they're being run according to what they say they're doing. So we think it's normal. Does the film's popularity somehow recognize the family's obtuseness as understandable? And that's what frightens me about it, the film. Or was that dullness that the family exhibits, Hus included and his wife, you don't get to know the children, was that dullness merely a pretense that was uncovered in such scenes as Hus's pride in having the deportation and murder of Hungarian Jews named after him, Operation Hess, in which 400,000 people were killed at the very end of the war. He was brought back from Berlin to manage it, and he took pride in the film when he gets the announcement that it's going to be named after him. So that's April 44. Unlike Hus, Father Lone did fascinate me, maybe because he's another Jesuit, and that is why I composed a diary of his reactions. It had to be imagined because Lone only spoke twice of the fact of his meeting with Hus. His only public mention was a sermon on the unexpected demands that might come with priestly ordination. I wrote to the Polish archives, Jesuit archives, about whether I could get hold of that sermon. And they wrote back, they don't have a copy. But the man who he gave it to was still alive and is not deceased. So he wrote back and explained, that what I just said, what it was all about, the emphasis being on the unexpected demands that come with priesthood. I learned a great deal from my second, I want to move to my, Lone in this imagination, although it's not totally, many of the things I say in the diary are rooted in other historical sources for Father Lone. He was the Jesuit provincial for 12 years during the whole war in Poland. But the large part of Lone's fascination for me was the dilemma he faced. What a dilemma. Here was a Polish priest dealing with the manager of the murder of 1 million human beings, all right? Several of whom were Jesuits. Most of them, of course, were Jewish Poles, but several of them were Jesuits whom he personally had known. And here he's confronting the manager. The other question he had in doing this, meeting with Hus, how would the Polish nation regard this, having lost millions of people? And now a Polish priest is the one who absolves them? There's always been a question about whether some other priest turned down the great opportunity to meet with Hus because they didn't want the disgrace that would attach to them, possibly. And that's why we know very little about Lone. It's too dangerous a memory, it seems to me. And the reason why it has special seriousness there is he'd be asking for absolution he'd be given absolution at the very time that the communist government was conducting 32,000 trials for war crimes and collaboration. So the contrast, and the Polish government used this, the communist government used this. Look what the church is doing. They're finding excuses, and we're putting them on trial. They're assisting them escape from Poland. So there were a lot of things for Lone to consider. Wouldn't there be popular support for punishing the criminals? There was popular support. Lone died in 1991, and I thought this meeting between Lone and Hus would interest others, and so I approached our contributors, the 17, with the invitation to weigh in on it. They have, and I believe superbly so. My second question. What insights might be derived by the reader of this book? I learned a great deal from the contributors about the dimensions of forgiveness that need to be considered in acts like this. Was Dietrich Bonhoeffer's warning about cheap grace the key insight? It was for me as I first approached this issue. Grace as a cut-rate sacrament without cost. That's Bonhoeffer. But how could it be the key if it did not take into account not just the theological, but the political dimensions of forgiving hearse, or the very impact on our civilization of such easy forgiveness? Would it suggest that God does not care about our deeds as long as we, to quote the song, own up to them? Own up to them in the end. Isn't Jewish emphasis on the personal interaction rather than the officially sacramental a more adequate perspective on the action of forgiveness? This incident raises troubling questions for me, the meeting. Among them, are religious rights articulated from the perspective of the victimizers rather than the victims? Are confessors, the clergy in general, mandated to approach criminals with the purpose of helping them achieve peace of mind rather than understanding of their crimes and remorse for their conduct? In an age of regular interreligious encounter such as ours, isn't there need to evaluate the impact of one's own religious rituals on the spiritual lives of other faith communities? These and many more are the questions that the commentators give, and their contributions provide a rich meditation on the dilemmas we face with the limited spiritual resources we have inherited. But I'm going to let them speak for themselves. Thank you very much.
So before we turn to hearing from our contributors, let me introduce them properly. First, we have on the far ends of the table Marina Berzins-McCoy, who is professor of philosophy at Boston College. Next to Jim is Ruth Langer, professor of Jewish Studies and associate director of the Center for Christian Jewish Learning at Boston College. Next to Marina is Serena Perrick, distinguished professor of philosophy at the Department of Philosophy and Religion at Northeastern University. And in the middle, Francis X. Clooney, S.J. Parkman Professor of Divinity and Professor of Comparative Theology at Harvard University, and formerly a member of the Theology Department at Boston College. It's so good to have you all here, and at least managing traffic to get here. So thank you. So we're going to begin with a question to Marina. So in your essay, you highlight the importance of self-knowledge for the process of seeking forgiveness. You've actually written a book on forgiveness. And you think about this, especially in the Catholic context, the rite of reconciliation. So what can be instructive for us about the failings of self-knowledge that seem evident in the case of Rudolf Huss, our Commandant?
Yeah, thanks. And I also wanted to really thank Jim for inviting us all into this project. It really made me think more deeply about these questions. I really enjoyed reading the other essays in the volume. It was a really wonderful experience. So thank you for giving us this opportunity and sharing this question with the world as well. So in the Catholic rite of reconciliation, as many of you will know, a penitent person is supposed to precede confession with an examination of conscience and to come to confession with genuine contrition, repentance. The aim is to be converted in some way, to seek conversion, and to have that. The Catholic Catechism is very clear that it should be a genuine interior conversion and sorrow, and not simply some kind of external act or whatever. So before I had read Huss's memoirs, I thought that the problem I was going to come to, his confession of what he had done, would be, trying to reconcile the horrors of the Shoah with, not particularly at Auschwitz, with the deep held conviction I have that God is merciful and forgives, and that mercy is God's nature. But what first happened was I noticed that there was a real lack of seeing Huss be sorrowful about the things that we think he ought to be sorrowful about. So I'll just read a couple of those lines. He says that his actions at the camp are, quote, wrong, absolutely wrong, but he also says things like, I was never cruel, nor did I let myself get carried away to the point of mistreating any of the prisoners. He regrets that he spent so much time at the camps and didn't spend as much time with his wife as he wanted to be able to do, and that he neglected his family. He writes that his biggest regret is the camps had a negative effect in the long run relative to the hope of the National Socialist Party. So, for example, he says that the problem with the camps was that it was counterproductive to those goals, and that, quote unquote, the Jews have come most closer to realizing their final goal. So I think, like probably many of you, I felt a sense of revulsion and heartbreak over how it could be possible for someone who's trying to come to terms with this to be so far from what we would hope would be the case. And as a philosopher, I think I see it as a problem of self-knowledge and a more universal problem of self-knowledge, right? So in some sense, Huss is not just interpreting events incorrectly, he's interpreting himself incorrectly. He's interpreting what his role is and who he is in this broader social fabric. I'm not in a position to determine whether, how exactly we're to locate Huss exactly in this web of forgiveness in a way that I think God can. But I think for me, the question is, how do we apply this to ourselves? How do we think about places where we ourselves may think we have self-knowledge, not only as individuals, but as a community? For example, where do we maybe not get the narrative right about where we might be complicit in social sin or social narrative events? We have, especially in this political culture, have a tendency to be very certain of like where we fall in those things. And so I think that's one thing I try to talk about a little bit in my essay. And the other thing is, I don't think we should think about God's mercy as something that's conditioned on the penitence or contrition of the person, right? Even though that might be what you're supposed to do in coming to the confessional, and everything I've said about self-knowledge, I believe. But what I also tried to write about is this idea that God's mercy is much bigger than the question of forgiveness, that God's mercy also includes things like healing victims. God's mercy includes trying to repair communities. God's mercy, as Cardinal Walter Casper says, is not at odds with God's justice. That for us, it may, in fact, be that way, right? There might be times where the pull of mercy and justice against one another, we can't figure out how to reconcile those things because what looks like justice for us is not compatible with mercy at that moment. Like, I don't know myself how to have mercy for someone who's more concerned about how he treated his wife than that. But I think that's not the ultimate problem. I mean, ultimately, it's God's mercy that transforms people potentially. It's like the mercy comes first, right? In the order of being, God's mercy is the very thing that allows transformation to happen, both in people who are the victims and potentially in victimizers. So that's like the prior thing, the thing that comes first. And I really want to emphasize that in my essay. And so I'll stop there for now and pass on the mics.
Good. Jim, do you want to offer any comments?
Challenges, whatever.
Well,
And use your mic.
oh yes, my mic here. Yeah, I was very struck by your focus on self-knowledge. And it made me aware that Huss, and this comes out in the film as well, on this new film, Zone of Interest, that Huss had nobody to learn from. I mean, there was nobody he was in love with. His wife was not treated seriously by him. And the only one he listened to was Himmler, rather, his boss. And it made me aware of how dependent we are on our loved ones for our own self-knowledge. It's not really self-knowledge, it's knowledge through the experience of our loved ones and friends. And I was struck by the difference that this particular case, the Hus case, has with the other commandant who was interviewed at length by the Italian reporter Guida Sereni, which was superb. It's published as a book called Into That Darkness. And she interviews the commandant of Treblinka, and she interviews the wife of the commandant of Treblinka. And what was so fascinating about this, in contrast to Hus, is that she's asked, would he have left the job, namely her husband, if you had said that you were going to leave him? And she said initially, yes. So it was her sense of failure that he would have listened to her. Now, Hus has nobody like that in his life. Now, she later at the end, she reverses. She couldn't sleep at night. She reverses herself and says, no, he wouldn't have left. But Sereni, I should say, thinks that she was accurate in the initial reaction, that he would have left the job. And take the risk of hiding, what that would involve. Thank you so much for your contribution as well. That's just one of the features in her essay, the self-knowledge. Think about where we get our self-knowledge from.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Mr. Marina and Jim. So on to Professor Langer. Ruth, in your essay, you highlight two issues. And this is something that Jim also alluded to. One is the differing practices of repentance and reconciliation in Catholic versus Jewish contexts. And the second is the problem of the possibility of Hus's absolution, especially towards his Jewish victims, in the context of Jewish practices of repentance. So can you speak to those two elements that you addressed? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Jim, for creating this conversation. There was one thing to sit down with the two diaries of the reports and your words and to think about it myself. And then it was yet another experience to sit and read through all the responses to it from the variety of different perspectives. I have to say that the three Jewish respondents and I were pretty much saying the same thing. And that is that this whole scenario would be pretty much unthinkable in a Jewish context. It's not that there isn't forgiveness for sin in Judaism. That's not at all the case. But in the case of, there are a couple criteria for forgiveness of sin in Judaism. And the first is that when it's a sin against one's fellow human beings, one makes amends with those people. God does not forgive until we've done the human work. So God's forgiveness is available, but only if we've done the repair among people on earth. So, and that's something which is absolutely critical. It's brought to the fore annually in the period leading up to Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, when if I've sinned against other people, I'd better go and seek that person's forgiveness before turning to God on Yom Kippur. If that person's not willing to forgive me and I'm sincerely penitent, if I've really made a change in myself so that confronted with the same situation, I would not sin the same way again, or even in a similar way again, then if I've really tried to appease, and that's the language that the rabbis use, to appease that person, I've done what I can do and God will forgive me. So that's one dimension of this. But the second dimension that's very relevant here is the question of whether God would forgive somebody who has, without moral quandary, murdered 1 million people. Is that forgivable? And especially when this person is also a leader who's caused other people to be murderers, including Jews murdering other Jews. And in this case, Do we really know the answer? The answer to that, of course, is no. Nobody's ever had a face-to-face conversation with God and gotten a clear answer to this. But the rabbis have a sense that somebody who is such a deep sinner and who leads other people into situations of sin, that person maybe is not forgivable. And maybe that it's sort of a Yiddish curse that comes up before Yiddish was ever invented. But in the Talmud, they say that these really, really, really egregious sinners, when they die, they'll go down to Gehenna, which is the Jewish word for the underworld, basically. Purgatory, I think in contemporary Christian speak, is the best translation of it. And nobody stays in Gehenna more than a year in Jewish understanding. But these folks, they go down to Gehenna and they stay there forever. And then it comes the Yiddish curse. And even if Gehenna were to cease to exist, they would still be there. And obviously, this is an extrapolation on, it's to make a point. It's in many ways a saying to people, don't be that person, don't go there. It's a preventative curse, in a sense. So this is radically different from Catholic processes of forgiveness and absolution, where the absolution comes, and the forgiveness comes before the human repair. It's on condition of the human repair. But the interaction with the priest, as I understand it for historical reasons, happens all at once because there weren't always priests available. And because it's that the priestly intervention is necessary, then one couldn't postpone the absolution. But then there's the question of whether God's mercy overwhelms God's justice. And in Jewish tradition, that claim is not made. God's mercy may be embedded in God's justice. And God's justice may be something which does not include forgiving somebody who is a murderer of 1 million people.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Jim, any thoughts?
A quick thought. I was very struck as what you were just saying about the curse, because in the Catholic discussion, it's often, somebody will say, oh, somebody like Hitler, can you imagine him being forgiven and going to heaven? And some people will say, yes, I can. That's God's mercy. Now, what I was struck by, one of the things I was struck by in your paper was that even going to Gehenna, there can come a point after 1 year where that life is extinguished. It's as if the person was never created. And in some ways, that sort of echoes that Jewish statement when certain names are made, such as Hitler, may his name be wiped out. So I was very struck by that. I never run across that before.
Thank you. We're going to move on to Professor Perrick. So Serena, in your essay, you argue that the absolution given to Hus by law enforced crimes at Auschwitz is actually a problem in political terms, not just in the past, not just in 1947, but also for us in the present. So can you expand on the political dimensions of absolution and forgiveness that this case illustrates?
Thank you very much. And let me just join everyone in thanking Jim for writing the book and for bringing us all together today. When Jim first invited me to contribute a response to this book, I was a little surprised because I got my PhD here. Jim was actually my advisor years ago. But I'm a political philosopher and I don't work particularly in this area, and I wasn't sure what I might have to say. But as I thought about it, I saw a connection between a feminist notion of reconciliation and forgiveness that I thought might be interesting to think about in relationship to the story we heard today. So a point that feminists think is very important about forgiveness is that we have to think of it relationally. in the sense that, we are not individuals, as if sprung from the ground, as Hobbes says, as if mushrooms sprung from the ground, but who we are is dependent on who we are with. Both the people we are closest to and love dearly, but also our community members and the people in our communities that we don't love or care about that much. But who we are is relational. And when it comes to forgiveness, we have to think of the impact of forgiveness in these relational terms. So it shouldn't be seen as a merely private act between an individual and their confessor, but you have to take seriously the impact on what Hannah Arendt called the common world. So the world that we share with all of these different people that we have this relational connection to. And when you think about it in that terms, the absolution was really lacking. I don't know if it was wrong, I don't know if it was ill-conceived, but it was definitely lacking. And it was lacking because it missed out on a world-repairing part of political reconciliation. So let me give you a different example of reconciliation that illustrates what I'm talking about. In the early 90s, there was an American woman named Amy Beale who got a Fulbright to go to South Africa. She was a very passionate anti-apartheid activist. She got a Fulbright to study there and was working in the Black townships. And one day a riot broke out and she was there, and she's a white woman from California, and she was killed in the riots. The people who killed her, the 4 men who in particular killed her, were put in jail, but they were released within a few years as part of Truth and Reconciliation Commission that followed the end of apartheid. And what happened is these men very sincerely went to Amy Beale's parents and apologized. And it took the parents time, but they eventually established a relationship with these men, in part because they were inspired by their daughter. Their daughter cared so much about this place, what apartheid had done to people, to Black people in particular in South Africa. And so they allowed themselves to be open to meeting these people. They eventually formed a relationship. They became very close. Her parents very publicly forgave them. And together they formed the Amy Beale Foundation, which was a charity that does work in the Black townships. And what we see from this example of forgiveness is that it wasn't merely for the sake of Amy Beale's parents, it wasn't merely for the sake of the people who had committed murder, but it actually formed a model for a country that was coming to think about how to live in the aftermath of extreme violence and extreme hatred, where you're living side by side and shoulder to shoulder with the very people who committed heinous crimes. And if you committed crimes, you're living with the victims and the families of the people who experienced those crimes. So how do you forgive? How do you move on? Well, it's not easy, it's hard, it takes time, but it's within relation. And it was able to repair the world in a certain sense, so that people could go on living together. This is the sense of the common world that was repaired. And the thing about the absolution that really, really struck me was that they missed out on this. As Ruth said, it wasn't that they apologized to the community. I mean, of course, they couldn't have done that. But could we imagine a way in which the absolution could have had some mechanism that would allow a sense for what that absolution was going to do for the victims, for the community, for Poland, for Jews around the world, for the end of the Holocaust? It could have been something really profound, and it could have served as a model for reconciliation, learning to live together. And I think that moment was missed. I was really struck by something Marina said, which was that when we talk about mercy, we think of the mercy of forgiveness and God forgiving the perpetrator. But there's also a mercy in helping the victims overcome the incredible sorrow and suffering that they have to endure. And I wondered if part of the absolution could have contributed to that more than it did. The timing was terrible, of course. It was a short period before an execution, and so of course this is not a plausible prescription in any way. But to think about forgiveness having these larger social and political dimensions, I think is an important feature when we think about things like mass murder, which are by and large, distinctly political occurrences. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Jim. Any reflections?
That's very brief. I mean, I enjoyed your essays. I enjoyed all of them, different ways. Maybe enjoy is not the right word to use. But I was very struck in your presentation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, which I knew something about. And it's a very good video, documentary on that Truth Commission. But what was striking is that it was an individual that the person was asking for, in terms of forgiveness. And if you read Hesse's memoir, I don't think he makes reference to any individual. It's totally anonymous people. I can't think of a single example of a person who is mentioned. Now that contrasts with the Commandant of Treblinka, whose book I mentioned earlier. Not that he was a nice person, he wasn't, but at least he remembered certain people he interacted with. With Hus, there's no sense of interaction. They were just anonymous. What they used to say when the trains came into Auschwitz, they're cargo. And he lived that way. They were cargo, no individuality.
Thank you. And finally to Professor Clooney. Frank, your essay speaks about the karmic debts of Rudolf Huss, which is an appropriate framing given your work as a scholar of Hindu-Christian comparative theology. So could you unpack what karmic debt is and why that is a useful way of thinking about the issues around Huss?
So I'm happy also to be here. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Dan. Thank you for the planning of this program. But I think I'm an inveterate comparativist, so everything I do ends up with a comparative angle. And I wasn't sure at all in taking up this invitation what I would do or think. But in pondering it, I remembered a story from the Buddhist canon about this robber called Angulimala. And Angulimala is a terrible robber whose fascination in life is to track down vulnerable travelers on the road, kill them, steal everything they have, and cut off one of their fingers and add it to a garland that he would wear around his neck. And so he's known for this. He terrorizes communities endlessly. And he has 999 fingers on his necklace, and he wants one more. And he sees Gautama, the Buddha, on the road. And so he gets out his sword and starts following him down the road and is going to kill him. But the Buddha is walking along slowly, meditatively, but somehow manages always to be walking too fast for Angulimala to catch up to him. And finally, Angulimala cries out in frustration, "Stop, stop. I want to kill you. I want your finger." And the Buddha turns and says to him, "No, you, Angulimala, you stop." And these words apparently were a karmic breakthrough for Angulimala, for suddenly it brought him to a stop in this insane, depraved process of killing people and taking the fingers and making this garland. And suddenly it was like this moment of enlightenment for him, where he realized that everything he had been doing was a horror and a foolishness and a terror. But it didn't end there. And the point that I tried to make using this story was that when Angulimala stops, he repents, he changes his life, he shaves his head, he becomes a begging monk, he follows the Buddha. But everywhere he goes, the people who are the families of those 999 victims are in the villages. And when they see this fellow, they know who he is, shaved head or not, and they beat him, they throw things at him, they grab his bowl full of food and they throw it down and break it and shatter it. And he's miserable, he's starving, he's been beaten endlessly. And the Buddha comes to him and says, "Angulimala, this is what comes after your enlightenment. Because you had so much evil, so much bad karma, you had to begin to work it out. You are blessed because you've had the chance in this lifetime to suffer enormously, which leads you to fewer future lifetimes for further study, for further suffering." And I talk about other canonical stories, talking about karma, going down to hells, but also being born into this world in forms where the crimes committed by you are now committed against you, or coming back as a maggot or a worm or something like that. All these stories. And it began to open up for me a sense of that the transformation, the act of radical change of life is the beginning of a process of purification rather than the end. So then this made me think about purgatory. And this came up in a number of the essays, and it's already been mentioned this evening. But that trying to get back and to say, well, what would it have meant for Hess himself and for Father Lone to imagine hearing a confession and giving absolution? This is the pre-Vatican II church. I went and puttered in the documents of the Council of Trent, Robert Bellarmine's Catechism, Peter Canisius's Catechism, which was so well known in Germany that surely Hess would have known something of it growing up. And in all these texts, there's a very clear sense that the forgiveness of sins and absolution is the beginning of a process where, as has already been said, reparation on earth, making amends to victims is required, and what is not done in your lifetime has to be done after death. And it seemed to me that maybe a way of looking at this and thinking of what that absolution meant was not kind of a bald, flat, God forgives or God shows mercy, but rather, as with Angulimala, the mass murderer of 999 people, a small number by comparison, it opens up the process where the suffering can begin, and the suffering will take place after death. And if Hess had any kind of a Catholic imagination left, and I'm not sure that that's the case, he would have not imagined that he would die and be executed and immediately fly up to heaven. But all these lurid stories of being in purgatory and suffering greatly over a long period of time, with a sense that eventually there would be some coming out in a way of purification. So I took that angle, and I think the Buddha story was not so much a flat comparison A and B, but opening up a perspective on how to think about what Hess may have thought, what Lone may have thought, and the Catholic teaching on absolution, reparation in this life and the life to follow. At the end of the essay, I kind of looked for updates on this, and I think we may not have the same imagination about heaven, purgatory, and hell as the pre-Vatican II Church. But I found in the writings of Pope Benedict reflections on, well, what does purgatory mean today? And purgatory not necessarily as a place where one spends a really long period of time, a year, 1,000 years, whatever, but rather this kind of infinitely intense moment of purification outside of time and space, where your sins are burned away. We'd like to think with incredible intensity and perhaps pain in certain cases, but nonetheless it happens. And Benedict puts it in terms of it could be seen as these punishments, or it could be seen that the person who's been given absolution is finally turning and confronting God face to face, or Christ face to face. And that intense encounter utterly burns away all that the person had done in a radical purification, leading me back, and I'll stop with this where I started, when Angulimala said to the Buddha, stop, and the Buddha turned and looked at him, it was in that moment, not only in the word stop, that the transformation began. If Hesse, after death, was somehow confronted by Christ, there could have been this intense, to us unimaginable moment of purification that was really opened but not accomplished by the act of absolution given by Father Lone. And so the circle of that and the role of purgatory being revived in the pre-Vatican II Church, I thought was a helpful contribution, but it was the best I could do, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. Jim?
Yes, I thought it was. There was a lot to think about in your essay. One of the things that I found myself wondering about is, because I'm rather skeptical that somebody like Hus, after having served for several years as Commandant of Auschwitz, went through this reversal in 2 or 3 days. Now, Lone, I don't have enough time to develop Lone. Lone was a substantial person. He wasn't, he was one of the leaders in the congregation, the Jesuit congregation, which is the highest legislative body of the Jesuits. The year before, he led the charge to get rid of the rule that prohibited those of Jewish ancestry from entering the Jesuits. So he was aware of what was happening in Poland and what the Jews had suffered. And Frank's essay did get me to reflect on how much of an impact would he have had dealing with Hess. You mentioned Christ, and it's true. I mean, the impact historically that some people have had in this radical conversion. I mean, today is actually the feast of St. Paul, the conversion of St. Paul, which is, it's falling off the horse, and there is that openness to radical conversion. I find it hard to imagine But in this man's case, especially as you study more of the history of that period and the realization that there were all sorts of Nazis who went to be re-Christianized, in part because they thought this would diminish the sentence that they got. Now, in Hesse's case, he was going to be executed. So, I mean, you do make a strong point of the transformation that can overcome and transform a person. And I find it hard, but I understand the point.
Good, thank you. I'd like to just open up the panelists now to ask questions of each other or reflect on what you've heard from each other. And then we'll pivot to some conversations from the audience as well. So, panelists, anything you want to reflect on a bit more?
I was struck by Serena's reference to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. And you gave one very strong example of something that worked. We were in South Africa 7.5 years ago. And what hit me in the face there was how many things had not worked. And I mean, this was some individuals who we encountered, the safari drivers who were speaking, I was sitting on my hands and clamping my mouth shut not to respond to them, what they were saying about the Africans. But other cases also. My sense was that there was a problem in South Africa because they cut the process short. It was a powerful process, it was a necessary process. And yet at the same time, they, at a certain point said, okay, enough already, we're done, everybody's good. And everybody was not good. So I think there's another challenge, another question of the timeline and that political impact that I think needs to come into that story.
Absolutely. There was lots of problems with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And, ultimately, I don't know if people judge it as a success. For many reasons, the racial dynamics persisted. Like more white people were forgiven than Black people, and this impacted even when Black people had committed crimes. And so there was a lot of inequities that came out of it. It didn't end up doing everything that was necessary. But I think what it did do is, politically at least, is to take seriously that justice needed to be, and sometimes and in some ways, from the bottom up. And it needed to be not just a top-down, international court of justice passing down a sentence, but it needed to be something that people did with each other and held each other to account. So you have, after Rwanda, you have the Gacaca courts, and you have some other examples of political reconciliation, this attempt to figure out how to live together side by side with the people who committed the crimes that you're now suffering from. And this was one imperfect attempt at it, but it was one of the first, and because it was in the aftermath of such a widely known and understood atrocity, it's gotten a lot of, philosophical attention, especially.
Can I jump in and say something as well? I just was also thinking about how many of our comments were concerned with temporality in the sense of, the human scale of time versus the divine, that this effort, for example, that Ruth, you were talking about, to go and reconcile with people in your community and do the hard work, which I think is constant with Jesus, actually. Jesus is very good at being faithful to his Jewish upbringing when he says, go leave your gift at the altar, go reconcile with your brother, right? Those kinds of comments. But that I do wonder how much some kind of philosophical attention to time and how time unfolds for us versus how God's mercy works is somehow latent underneath all of this.
And I would just add a comment about, listening particularly to Ruth's comment about the Jewish contributors and the Jewish attitude, the rabbinic attitude, that there's a kind of indeterminacy to what we're talking about, that given one's background, dispositions, the tradition one belongs to, there is a certain approach and certain repertoire of possibilities, and even within a tradition, more recent, older views. But the volume nicely presents a variety of views that really can't be reduced to the response of the volume, but multiple voices pondering this interreligiously is a very appropriate kind of indeterminacy in face of such a horrible situation.
One of the essays points out that, much of our approach to confession is pre-Vatican II. That if we understand absolution, not in terms of a judicial process where the judge is, overcoming the crime, but rather an accompaniment of the individual to God, but not a wiping out of the sin that the individual has committed. And that's the judicial model that the Vatican Council II tried to replace with the compassion model. Now, that said, one of the things in doing research for this book, I ran across Pope Francis's remark when he was a cardinal in Argentina, in which he spoke about sin that is unforgivable. And what he meant, what he said in this volume, was there are sins that show the fundamental corruption of the person that truth cannot penetrate through. And so, there is in the scripture, in the New Testament, that sins against the spirit are unforgivable. But no one ever, clarifies what are these sins against the spirit. Well, Francis in this essay did, in terms of people who have lived their lives in such a way as truth cannot penetrate them. And so that's Pope Francis. He's making enough controversial statements without adding that one. Because he too visited Auschwitz and spoke about the forgiveness that should be celebrated, as the other two popes who have visited Auschwitz also said.
Thank you, Jim. I think it's probably a good time now actually to pivot to fielding questions from the audience. And Shira, who is our graduate assistant for the Center for Christian Jewish Learning, will be circulating with a microphone. So we'll take, just one Shira will circulate, and we'll keep 3 mics up front. So if anyone has anything they want to ask or reflect on that you've been hearing. And while you're formulating we're right there. And I'll field some questions from online as well. So please go ahead.
Hi, first, thank you all so much. This is an amazing project, and it seems like a lot of work obviously went into it. My name is Jordan Jones. I'm an MDiv student at the STM, a Jesuit in formation. And this is just a topic of particular interest to me, and I've done what reading I can on this. I've read Hess's memoirs. And I guess my question is kind of a historical one, which is maybe twofold. One is, is there a historical sense of when Hess completed the memoir that we have in his time in prison vis-a-vis when he was executed? Was that something that he kind of was working on almost all the way until the time he was executed, or is it something that was completed months maybe before? The second question is, have you encountered, specifically, Jim, any historical accounts are there anything extant from prison guards or, any other eyewitnesses of this event? Because there is a lot of it sounds like maybe urban legend, I don't know, but there's kind of things that describe this story. And I'm just kind of curious, what are those aspects that we can take seriously, and what are the aspects that might seem to be someone's kind of creative reformulation of this account? Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and make sure you use the mic there.
With respect to your first question, it was the Polish government that asked him to write the memoir, and he did it. I don't know the exact dates, but it was all done before his execution. Obviously before his execution, but before he met Lone and well before. And so I think it was 1946 he wrote it out. It's rather lengthy. You read it. It's 300 pages. And it was published initially in Poland, but then in German and in the States in the early 90s. But he also testified at Nuremberg. He was brought to testify at Nuremberg, which he did. With respect to your second question, one of the things for working on this project, the legends are unbelievable. It's hard to answer your question. I don't know enough to separate out the legends from, let me give you one example. I did write to the Polish authorities, and I wrote to this abbot of a monastery in Britain. And he was cited, one of his sermons was cited in a YouTube, celebrating the fact that Hus, was triumphant and he was forgiven. And he didn't exactly say he went to heaven, but that was the sort of the implication. And he claimed that, as I recall, he claimed that Father Lone had said that. Or Father Lone would never have said that. Never. I know enough about him. I'd love to know more. But he didn't leave much of a paper trail, I'll tell you. I tried. I really did try. But so I wrote to the abbot to find out if this is what he really said. And he said he thinks he saw a reference to it in some YouTube. So he was repeating what a YouTube statement had made, and he thought it was a very promising thing. And he said he's horrified to think that it could be so misunderstood that he was celebrating this event. He said, I wanted exactly the opposite to occur. So again, I've stumbled into this time and time again. And Father Lone, I wish he had left the diary. I'm afraid that people are going to think the diary I wrote up is the one he really left. But I don't want to acknowledge it. But there is an example of a nun who said that she had never seen anyone so, or maybe it was there was a nun, but also a soldier who said he had never seen such sorrow in a man as he saw at Hess when he received communion. That Hess apparently was weeping. And in this video, the music video, he falls to his knees before the Lone. But again, what the truth of that is, I have no idea. And it's really difficult to get into this. I went to some archives, and I really thought I could track something down, and they told me, we've just changed the rules. It's an 80-year rule now. You have to wait 80 years after the person's death to get this access to personal data. So I calculated where I'd be in 80 years. This project was put aside. But no, it's a good question, and it's just that it's, well, even in the society, in the Jesuits, I never heard of Father Lone. I never heard that the Johnsons, the General Society elected right after, in 1946, was honored by Yad Vashem as a rescuer. If you look it up in the Dictionary of Jesuit History, it's not even mentioned. And so there's a curious void here that has made me, my suspicious nature as a New Yorker surfaces.
So a question from online, I'm going to try to summarize it here. This is for you, Jim, but maybe for others. Discusses, we can identify Hus as someone who had authority over other people and who can see his responsibility clearly, but there are so many other perpetrators who contributed to the death of so many millions during the Holocaust, not just Auschwitz, but other places. So I think what's underlying that observation is, what does the process of absolution, forgiveness, reconciliation, what would have to happen for all those thousands of people who were accomplices in order to affect something substantial in society? So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, Jim, Serena, or Maria, I know you also were thinking about that a lot, so I'd invite you to offer any reflections.
Well, I guess traditional Catholic teaching is, contrition and the commitment to not repeat what you've done. Now, I don't know how many, I know about the trials. One of the things I was struck by is there was a wonderful exhibit, as there are many wonderful exhibits in the German Historical Museum in Berlin. But one of them was on how these perpetrators were dealt with in different countries. And I had no idea that there really was substantial trial and punishment of people who had been collaborators. And the judgment, at least what I've read, is that most of these trials were fair, like the ones in Poland. We had this thing, the communists, with their show trials, but in fact, they did a lot of good investigation, and we have dependency on a lot of the information they developed in the trials and investigations before the criminal prosecution. But it's traditional. Vatican II, of course, has put less emphasis on confession. Murder, the church history, you probably know this better than I, some in the audience. Church history has varied in how to deal with people who commit serious crimes. There was an article just recently by a soldier who said that anybody who murders somebody should have to, do penance for a year. Now, I was at a conference once, a Holocaust conference, in which the person said that if the Germans were really repentant, they should embrace a life of relative poverty for a generation. And people in the audience said, "What? What nonsense is this?" So we don't have an obvious consensus on what's appropriate penance.
Thank you. I want to get a question here from Jim Keenan of the Jesuit Institute.
I'm really been following some of the writings of a philosopher, Judith Butler, and she uses this concept, grievability, and she talks about lives that are ungrievable, and how many people think of some other people as ungrievable. And what's the worst thing that can happen to a person is that they understand themselves to be among the ungrievable. She could talk about homeless people. Black Lives Matter is a protest saying that Black lives are grievable. I'm just thinking in terms of, repentance, sorrow, anything. It strikes me that in many instances of murder, mass murders, it's that the persons that they're killing are not grievable. That the question is not simply they've killed the person, but they've killed the person that they don't consider to be grievable. I haven't heard anything, it seems like it's all persons are the same, but in this instance, these were people that people were targeting as saying that they weren't grievable. So I just wanted to add that into the mix of the conversation to simply say that they did, the Holocaust is about removing people. It's not just about murder, it's about a race that they do not believe should be here. They're no longer grievable. So I just didn't hear that, and I wanted to bring it up.
Thank you. Does anyone want to speak to that? Maria?
I completely agree with you, Jim, about what you just said. And something I mentioned in my essay is I talk about Dorothy Zoll and her talk about lament and solidarity. So another response, along with working for reconciliation and the questions of forgiveness for me, is really a community that laments what is actually lost. And I think lament is a form of recognition, right? So it doesn't necessarily take away the fact that someone was ungrievable, to use Butler's language, but lament kind of counteracts that, right? And says, no, it happened, it's real, we don't forget. So I think that's another part of that the horizontal dimension that goes along with the divine mercy that comes vertically.
Thank you.
I was really struck in Huss's words, where he doesn't seem to lament or grieve the people, and I think that's what struck many of us in the book. As making his confession insincere. Not only does he not lament, he wishes he had just done things more efficiently, and like if he had the opportunity, you have the sense he would eagerly do it. And so I think you're right, but that the way that's connected to contrition, I think, is absolutely correct.
I think we're drawn to an end. So, Jim, would you like to offer some concluding reflections?
I'm not going to try this.
But just anything off the top of your head that you would like to offer.
It's been very rich conversation, and obviously you'd have to read the book. But no, the nuances of these essays are terrific, and they really, I mean, I was familiar with, the issues, but I really learned so much from the different nuances about forgiveness and the church and the history. I don't have much of a history of the confessional practice, but it's important to have that because otherwise the popular culture gives us the impression of what confession really is, and what going into the sacrament of reconciliation actually is what we refer to it now as, rather than confession. But I'm not sure that's penetrated the common Catholic culture in the same way that the terrific changes in Jewish-Christian relations, Jewish-Catholic relations in particular, haven't penetrated the popular culture. You still hear incredible things said. And when I said the thing that we have to think about what the impact of our spiritual rituals are on other groups, in some ways the church has done that in terms of thinking about the scriptures. What sort of scriptures are appropriate? And should we just continue because they've always been said? Good Friday, now of course, they changed the ritual prayer, but there's a lot of work to be done. And I don't know, maybe this, we were too hopeful about how change can take place. And it may take many more generations before we actually have a substantial Jewish-Christian relationship that Catholics really appreciate in a much more sophisticated way than it seems that they do now, despite the work of the center.
Despite the work of the center. Jim, congratulations on this book. It's a real accomplishment, and congratulations to all the contributors, both here and elsewhere. This has been really, it's provided for a very rich reflection. It's accessible. Everyone's written in a way that's accessible, and I hope it really does have an impact on our conversations about what forgiveness means, what reconciliation means, what the signals for further work that the church might need to engage in. So I thank you all. A note, you do need to read the book, and it's for sale in the hallway. And also, for those of you online, there was a link for you also to purchase it. There's also some refreshments outside. So please join me in thanking Jim and our panelists.